My daughter's watching.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first instalment in the brand new edition of the Institute for Northern Studies public seminar series. It's lovely to see so many of you joining us this afternoon. For those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Andrew Lind. I'm a lecturer here at the Institute for Northern Studies, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing these sessions. Now, before we get underway this afternoon, I just have a couple of very quick housekeeping points, just to make everyone aware that this session is being recorded. So if you don't want to appear on YouTube for all your friends and family to see, please make sure that you keep your camera and your microphone off. But what I will do is at the end of the presentation, I will allow everyone to switch their cameras and mics on if they'd like to put any questions directly to our speaker. If you'd like to do that via the chat function, you're welcome to do so, and I will read that out. I'd also like to mention that the Institute for Northern Studies Public Seminar Series is a proud partner of the Explorathon initiative, which aims to publicise research at Scottish universities while making it more accessible and strengthening connections with our communities. If you have a moment later on today, I'm going to pop a survey link in the chat, and we'd really appreciate it if you could just click on that and give us your thoughts. It's very quick, it'll only take a couple of minutes, but it would be very much appreciated. Now, that's all the kind of more boring stuff out of the way. Today it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jimm Simon. Jimm is a retired non-profit executive and consultant who spent the majority of his career working with museums, historic sites, and Aboriginal organisations. Since retiring, Jimm completed an MLit with us here at the Institute for Northern Studies, during which he wrote his dissertation on Robert Louis Stevenson's travel writing. Having caught the research bug, Jimm then enrolled upon the PhD programme here at INS, and he spent the last year walking in the footsteps of Stevenson, a journey which has taken him to Edinburgh, New York, California, and Samoa. Today's paper has given Jimm the opportunity to reflect upon that journey and Stevenson's continuing legacy 130 years after his death. Jimm's paper is titled Robert Louis Stevenson at 175, and I'll now hand over to the man himself. Welcome, Jimm.
Thank you, Andrew. So first, just to explain my accent, I am Canadian, and I just am looking at the list of people who are watching. I see both my daughter and my wife are watching from Canada, so I'm on my toes about that. But I started looking at Robert Louis Stevenson during an assignment here at UHI. Sort of my gateway to Robert Louis Stevenson was an assignment to do a close reading of from Jekyll and Hyde. And that one thing led to another, and eventually I ended up doing a dissertation for, as Andrew said, for a master's in Scottish culture, looking at Robert Louis Stevenson as the father of travel writing. When I was here 2 years ago, it was suggested to me that since I had a graduate degree with merit, that I might want to consider the PhD program, and that sounded appealing to me. And I'm in my second year of that program now. With my background and career in museums, I was originally intrigued by the number of places that Stevenson was commemorated in historic sites. And frankly, I saw this as a good excuse to both research an interesting topic and a good excuse to take part in some interesting travel. And over the course of the past year, I found myself flying in a 6-seater plane over the Adirondack Mountains, hiking in a state park in California, driving across the Golden Gate Bridge by accident, and climbing a mountain trail through the tropical forests of Samoa. Along the way, I've encountered some fascinating people who know more about Robert Louis Stevenson than I will ever hope to know, and I've heard about why they continue to commemorate, study, and even venerate Robert Louis Stevenson. I've learned that Robert Louis Stevenson is important in 2025 for reasons that are both diverse and complex. Hopefully I'll talk about some of those in the next 45 or 50 minutes. I want to give you a taste of some of what I've learned and leave some time for questions. So the question I'm exploring is, why are we fascinated by Robert Louis Stevenson 175 years after his birth? I'm going to look at each of the 4 bullet points that are listed on that slide. And I'm going to make the statement that Robert Louis Stevenson, his life and his work, are a palimpsest, or a canvas upon which we can continually layer new meanings and interpretations while maintaining the core elements of the original form. People around the table are taking notes. It's making me nervous. Just for fun, I asked the question, who was Robert Louis Stevenson to an AI program, a co-pilot? And it gave me this answer. It's all accurate, and it's all most people want to know. It might be more than most people want to know. But it's pretty superficial, but it does cover the basic points. Robert Louis Stevenson was indeed a famous novelist, and he wrote in a variety of genres, including adventure stories, historic-based fiction, and Gothic horror. And according to scholars who count these things, Stevenson wrote 8 other novels beside his big 3, Treasure Island, Kidnapped, and Jekyll and Hyde, including some things like Katrina or David Balfour, depending on where you live, The Master of Ballantrae, Black Arrow. In addition to writing full-length novels, Robert Louis Stevenson also wrote numerous short stories in each of these genres, as well as others, and possibly his most famous short story is titled Thrawn Janet. His work in adventure and historic fiction set many of the standards that are still used in these genres today. He also wrote in other genres. In poetry, Child's Garden of Verse is regarded as a classic in children's poetry. It's suggested reading for many school curriculum around the world, and in Samoa, the poems are set to music and sung in schools, at public gatherings, and even in some church services. Travel writing, arguably, he's the father of modern travel writing. Stevenson's American travel pieces were both innovative, and his style of being both observational and at the same time interacting with local people established the classic form of what we call travel journalism. And his South Sea writings. RLS, as he's known, traveled the South Seas just as colonialism was at its peak. He dined and drank with the last king of Hawaii, and he supported the independent king of Samoa over the figurehead appointed by the Imperial German government. RLS's work in Samoa is regarded by the Samoan people as an essential part of their cultural heritage. Stevenson wrote in Samoan, about Samoa, and with Samoan input, including recording traditional folktales like the Bottle Imp. A footnote to history, 8 Years of Trouble in Samoa is considered by Samoan people as a historic document. Museum curator Margaret Felice Silva told me Robert Louis Stevenson put Samoa on the map. RLS visited and defended the rights of many Polynesian communities, not just Samoa, including visiting the lepers who were exiled to the island of Molokai. RLS was a prodigious writer, and he left behind volumes of correspondence, and according to Professor Leo Damrosch, over 100 essays on a wide range of topics. Let's take a look at some of Stevenson's literature and its interpretation. To begin, just like fashions change over the decades, so does our perception of what is and isn't good writing. In the early part of the 20th century, a lot of things happened: world wars, worldwide pandemic called the Spanish flu, and the Depression, just to name a few things. And according to the writings of noted RLS biographer Claire Harmon and others, during those times, the reputation of Robert Louis Stevenson's work of serious literature has waxed and waned, her term. I propose that this shifting reputation has evolved for a number of reasons. First, RLS was dismissed by the literati. He was lumped in with other romantics or neo-romantics. As the most recent biography of Robert Louis Stevenson points out, Stevenson was dismissed as serious literature by the early 20th century English elite, including members of the Cambridge University Educated Society, known as the Bloomsbury Group, that included people like novelist Virginia Woolf and economist John Maynard Keynes. Stevenson was a diverse writer who wrote in a number of genres, as I've discussed, and he didn't concentrate on one area of specialization. This was cited as evidence that he wasn't a serious, dedicated writer. He was also dismissed by others as a commercial writer. Indeed, he was. Stevenson himself spoke of the need to raise a lot of money to pay for his lifestyle, particularly when he was supporting his mother, wife, stepson, stepdaughter, her first husband, and a grandchild, and all of his Samoan employees. Similarly, RLS' great work, Jekyll and Hyde, was written as a Christmas crawler by a 35-year-old who still depended on his father for an allowance. He was dismissed as a serialized writer. RLS wrote for magazines, but to be fair, so did Dickens. He didn't seem to suffer the same criticism for that. He was dismissed as a children's writer. RLS wrote boys' adventure stories and children's poetry, and in the words of Linda Dryden, Stevenson's position has oscillated between that of celebrated man of letters and popular writer of boys' adventure stories. Today, 175 years after his birth, RLS has a renewed reputation, and he is spoken of and commemorated, here in Scotland at least, as part of the trio Burns, Scott, and Stevenson. It says there, academic recognition does not translate to popular recognition, and RLS has remained a commercial and popular success. What has contributed to the RLS revival to the point where we continue to study and memorialize him? Well, part of the answer lies in the fact that Robert Louis Stevenson didn't actually need reviving because he never stopped being prominent in popular culture. In 2018, Stevenson was listed by AmericanLiterature.com as the 26th most translated author in the world. He's translated into a number of languages. Apparently, he's just behind Dickens, who was 25 on that list. These translations introduce his storytelling to diverse cultures, broadening his international impact. The adaptability of his narratives ensure ongoing appreciation in many languages worldwide. Stevenson's work is on suggested reading lists, part of curriculum in schools and universities around the world. His poems have been turned into songs. His books have been subject of parodies and cartoons. And with Dr. Bruce Banner and the Incredible Hulk from the Marvel comic universe, if they weren't painted over the broad brush strokes of Jekyll and Hyde. Probably not. Many scholars have spent their academic careers studying the work of Robert Louis Stevenson. I think every sentence of some works like Jekyll and Hyde have been parsed, analyzed, and had meaning ascribed to them. I'm just going to take a brief look at Jekyll and Hyde as an example of the ongoing presence of Robert Louis Stevenson. Today, Jekyll and Hyde are ranked along Frankenstein and Dracula as part of the language. However, many people know the characters through movies or parodies, like the Hulk, without reading the books. Even the writing of the book is bound up in a fable. As the story goes, Robert Louis Stevenson awoke from a dream and wrote Jekyll and Hyde. The original manuscript version of this has been lost after Robert Louis Stevenson apparently threw it into a fire and rewrote the entire story in 3 sleepless days. That version may be wholly or partially apocryphal, but it was certainly promoted by Robert Louis Stevenson's cousin, Graham Balfour, who wrote the first biography of RLS in 1901. In June of 2025, I visited the local independent bookstore near my home in Canada, and as become my habit, I went to the XS section of the books, marked literature, and I found 6 different editions of Jekyll and Hyde all on the shelf, all published in the last 20 years in either the United Kingdom, New York, or California. Each version strives to be different from the other, and these volumes include a varied selection of other Stevenson stories, introductory or explanatory essays by American or English distinguished professors and biographers, including one by the Russian scholar Viktor Nabokov, who lectured on Stevenson for 10 years. Various forms of chronologies of RLS's work, his life, suggested other readings, and things like glossaries to Victorian terms or Scottish terms. As soon as it was published, Jekyll and Hyde was widely popular in the United Kingdom and America, the equivalent of today's #1 bestseller. It was read by Queen Victoria. It was dramatized very early. In 1888, the play was performed in London and was so controversial and convincing that for a time, the lead actor was suspected of being the real-life Jack the Ripper. The story was seen as such a moral allegory that Victorian preachers used it as a moral example from the pulpit. The book was made into a silent movie in 1908 and again in 1931, in which Frederick March won an Oscar for his portrayal. March showcased a dramatic transformation between the gentle Jekyll and the monstrous Hyde. This early movie is so blatantly sexualized that it had to have scenes cut out even in a pre-censorship code days of early American cinema. The original version includes near nudity and graphic sadomasochistic themes in which Hyde whips his sexual prisoner. Hyde is portrayed as a grotesque monster without control and starts the transformation in popular culture from Hyde being a smaller part of and less than Jekyll, as written by Robert Louis Stevenson, to being a hulking, threatening monster. It's important to note that the original short story as written by RLS is not explicit, does not detail the looks of Hyde, of Hyde, and any violence or sexuality is alluded to rather than described. As Victor Nabokov said, the book has unspecified, vague, but ominous allusions to pleasure and dreadful vices. The movies are a different matter. Subsequent movies and portrayals, including the 1941 version starring Spencer Tracy, emulate Frederick March as much as they do Stevenson, if not more. For his part, Stevenson called Strange Case of Jekyll and Hyde a potboiler. Professor Kelly Hurley suggests that it is the forerunner to modern detective stories. This implies that it was not originally a horror story or a story about a monster. Indeed, Ian Rankin, author of the Rebus series, has called RLS his hero, and he has stated that the Rebus series origins lie in trying to be as close to the original Jekyll and Hyde as possible. Because of the use of illusion in Strange Case, it is open to interpretation. I've read in-depth analysis about the obvious references to homosexuality, to dream analysis that predates the writings of Freud, to suggestions that the short story is about the problems of moneyed elite versus poverty, or Victorian repression, or the dangers of medicine, or mind-altering drugs and addiction, or even about vaccinations. Any element of life that seems to be represented as a duality seems to be applied to Stevenson's story. As McCracken Fleischer says, who knows how Hyde will appear tomorrow? Society is always watching. Other works of Robert Louis Stevenson have received the same treatment. Early adaptation to film of other novels tended to rely on sensationalism and less on literary form to sell tickets. This is a shot of the 1931 Treasure Island. Unfortunately, this is a horribly, in my opinion, overacted movie that creates caricatures of the characters. And Wallace Beery, here portrayed as Long John Silver, portrays Long John like he's auditioning to be one of the Muppets. And we sympathize with him, whether he's murdering and marooning his shipmates or blubbering over how nice he is treated by Jim Hawkins. Hawkins is played in an over-the-top melodramatic style by 12-year-old Jackie Cooper. This movie probably sold a lot of Stevenson's books, but did very little to bolster his reputation as a serious writer. As we know, pirate parodies and cartoons have proliferated over the years. They've kept RLS in print and in the public eye and part of popular culture. Today, Robert Louis Stevenson is everywhere. Here's a photo I took of a billboard for the Scandinavian Ballet adaptation of Jekyll and Hyde that was performed in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in the center of Canada, that includes blatant homosexuality, very disturbing scenes in a cabaret, and in an insane asylum, none of which appear in the book. Here's a picture of a bottle of balsamic vinegar, thanks Jeannie, on a store shelf in the state of Utah that includes a quote attributed to Stevenson. I don't know if he actually said it, but it's attributed to him. Judge each day not by the harvest you reap, but by the seeds you plant. In the middle there is a picture of a can of beer in Apia, Samoa, branded after the name of Stevenson's plantation, Valima, which translates as Five Waters, which is an interesting name for a beer. And then there is a mural that was on the wall of a Scots rail train from Edinburgh to Aviemore. And I think that the designer had a sense of humor and got away with something, as it says, I travel not to go anywhere, but to go. And it's on the wall of a bathroom. I travel for travel's sake. The great affair is to move. I think some designer really, I don't know. I don't think that they read that too closely before they put it up. Stevenson is an ongoing source of information for biographers. When this seminar was publicized by UHI, someone online said that it was hard to imagine there was anything new to be said about Stevenson. Well, there's been 2 new biographies published in the last year. Earlier this year, author and journalist Camille Perry wrote A Wilder Shore, the romantic odyssey of Fanny and Robert Louis Stevenson. This is billed as a dual biography and provides a lot of information on Stevenson's wife, Fanny, as well as Stevenson. Just last week, a second biography by Harvard professor Leo Damrosch, emeritus professor, was published, and it's called Storyteller, which is an allusion to the Samoan name for Robert Louis Stevenson, which was Tusitala, which means storyteller. I haven't read it. It just came out last week. I just got it in the mail the day before I left for Scotland, and it's over 500 pages. I'm hoping there's some new information in there. I'm sure there is. Stevenson's a biographer's dream. Here's some elements of his life. In the 2001 biography of Stevenson, Philip Callow wrote, "There's been no shortage of books about Stevenson, and they keep coming. What is the fascination?" Well, in addition to the latest two biographies, RLS biographies have been regularly published since the first one in 1901. Well-known Robert Louis Stevenson authority Dr. Roger Swearingen published a comprehensive survey of papers, studies, biographies, and critical essays that runs to dozens of pages. Noted biographies of Robert Louis Stevenson published in the last 25 years include the aforementioned Philip Callow, who suggests that both Robert Louis Stevenson and his wife suffered emotional or perhaps intellectual disabilities like autism, and that both of them may well have had gender identity issues. In 2005, the Claire Harmon biography expounds on examples of duality that occurred throughout Robert Louis Stevenson's life. Harmon also sensationalizes many aspects of speculation on Robert Louis Stevenson's drug use, possible syphilis from prostitutes, and his sexual preferences. Harmon even suggests that RLS challenges in life are both hereditary and from his upbringing. It's important to remember that Robert Louis Stevenson lived at the height of the Victorian era and the British Empire. It was a time of emerging technologies, including passenger rail and steamship, telegraphs, and telephones. Victorian norms and social conventions for educated Brits were not to be flaunted in the way Stevenson did. There's a number of Stevenson's elements of Stevenson's life that could be written as fiction, really. For example, his early life. The fame of the Stevenson family predates the birth of RLS by generations. Stevenson is a descendant of the famous lighthouse Stevensons, who are themselves the topics of books. They were civil engineers who designed and installed many of the lighthouses around the coasts of Scotland, including many famous sites such as Skerryvore, Bell Rock, and Muckle Flugga, which used to be the most northerly inhabited site in Scotland. Robert Louis Stevenson's father also applied his skills to improving the interior workings of lighthouse lights. This was remote, dangerous, and physical work that often involved working around dangerous tides and storms. Work of the Stevenson family prevented untold shipwrecks and probably saved countless lives. It was anticipated that RLS would join the family business, and like his grandfather, father, uncles, and cousins, he would become another one of the Lighthouse Stevensons. RLS had other ideas, and he spent much of his university days in the dark closes or back alleys of Old Town Edinburgh. In his own words, he consorted with three penny whores. He barely attended school as an engineer, and although he did, as a compromise for his father, achieve a law degree, he never really actually practiced law. Instead, young RLS did things like modifying his name to make it sound more French, declaring himself an atheist, spending time in French artist colonies, wearing his hair long, and he dressed in a velvet cloak and generally did whatever he could to distance himself from Victorian standards. All the while, he continued to be supported by his father financially. For her part, Stevenson's mother was a member of the Balfour family, who were important moral philosophers and theologians. Stevenson's mother, Margaret, was also often sick, and RLS was mostly tended to by his maid, Alison Cunningham, or as she was known, Cummy. She was deeply religious and often filled young, sick RLS's head with terrifying religious tales. Cummy was the first of the older women who influenced RLS, and he dedicated his book, Child's Garden of Verse, to Cummy. As a young single man, RLS would have questionable relationships with other older women, including Frances Sitwell, who was a divorcee 11 years RLS's senior, and Mrs. Sitwell was living with her partner and later her husband, Sidney Colvin, during the time she was exchanging scandalous love letters with Louis. Stevenson traveled extensively during his early years, both with his family or his cousin Bob, and in addition to trips to Switzerland, France, and Italy for his health, Stevenson took early walking tours and lighthouse inspection tours in the Highlands as part of the family business. To be blunt, RLS had an interesting, somewhat scandalous, and quirky marriage. There's a story that 26-year-old Robert Louis Stevenson first encountered Fanny Van de Grift Osborne, who was 10 years older than he was, and her teenage daughter Belle, who was just 9 years younger than Robert Louis Stevenson, when he entered a room in an artist's retreat in France through an open window. Fanny was married at the time to Sam Osborne, a burly silver miner who she left back in California. Fanny's life before, during, and after her 15 years or so with RLS is in itself the subject of much study in biographies, including this year's Camille Perry book that I mentioned. Fanny, in addition to being born in the Wild West, had crossed the Panama Peninsula by wagon with her children, lived in a makeshift California silver camp. She could ride a horse and she could shoot a gun. Biographers often comment on her dark complexion, and there is a speculation she may have had some native Mexican heritage. During her time with Robert Louis Stevenson, Fanny spent so much time attending to Louis's health that she was a subscriber to the medical journal The Lancet. In 1879, Fanny, who was living with her children and Stevenson in Paris, received a telegram from her still husband, Sam Osborne, and she returned to California. We don't know what was in the telegram. Very soon thereafter, RLS embarked on his own journey to America, chasing Fanny, which he used as fodder for the book, The Amateur Immigrant. After a stay in Monterey, Sam Osborne agreed to divorce Fanny. Shortly thereafter, Robert Louis Stevenson and Fanny headed north to the Napa Valley where they honeymooned along with Fanny's son Lloyd. The family found cheap lodgings high in a mountain overlooking the town of Calistoga in a rattlesnake-infested, abandoned mine building at the mouth of a tapped-out silver mine, where they were occasionally visited and provisioned by eccentric dwellers from nearby camps. Eventually, the Stevenson family moved back to Scotland and then to Switzerland, where Fanny had her own medical problems. Lloyd was sent to a boarding school in Bournemouth, England, where eventually Robert Louis Stevenson and Fanny settled for a time in a house bought for them by Stevenson's father, Thomas, and named after Thomas's famous lighthouse, Skerryvore. Just, he had to remind him he bought the house. He named after his own lighthouse. This period was the most conventional, though still quirky, time in Robert Louis Stevenson's life, and also the most productive and financially rewarding. In Bournemouth, RLS became independently rich and internationally famous. Whilst there, he published his most memorable works, including Treasure Island, Kidnapped, Amateur Immigrant, Child's Garden of Verse, and of course, Jekyll and Hyde. Several years later, after RLS died, Fanny spent her time reaping the rewards of Stevenson's success. She lived in California with one Edward Field, who was 38 years her junior. Then when Fanny died in 1914, the same Edward Field married Fanny's daughter Belle, who was only 20 years older than him. There's speculation that Field was one of the 4 men that had been shared by mother and daughter over their lifetime. RLS was extremely sick his whole life. At the time, he was diagnosed as having TB, but modern medicine speculates that it may have been the chronic and hereditary disease, this is the part of the presentation I've been dreading the most, hemorrhagic telangiectasis, if I did that justice, or Osler-Rendu-Weber syndrome, also known, thankfully, as HHT. Stevenson was so sick that over the course of his short life, he nearly died several times. For example, Stevenson was so sick when he arrived in Monterey that Fanny almost did not recognize him. Shortly after arrival, he set off for a trip into the backcountry where he became so sick that he had to be nursed back to health by a goat farmer who found him in a near coma under a tree. He'd fallen off his horse. Recently discovered letters of RLS indicate that he almost died again on the return trip to England. Stevenson coughed up so much blood from his lungs that in later life he often couldn't open his mouth. And he was cautioned not to talk, so he worked out a system of sign language with his stepdaughter Belle. He was so frail that he often worked in bed, and many of his books, were written by Belle through dictation by a man bedridden, so emaciated and weak that he couldn't find the strength to wield a pen. Through it all, Stevenson was never without a lit cigarette. and he partook regularly of such dubious Victorian cures as opium, laudanum, cocaine, and hashish. RLS and Fanny also drank heavily. RLS began drinking as a very young child when he was fed antimonial wine. Despite all of this, Stevenson traveled the world from Eastern Europe across 2 oceans, all over the United States, and throughout the South Seas. As I said, almost every trip has an incident of him nearly dying, but it didn't keep him home or keep him in bed if he could get up. One story recounts of a younger Robert Louis Stevenson regularly spending winters in the clear air of snowbound Swiss valleys. He found great sport in climbing as high as he could up the snow-covered mountains late at night with a toboggan that he would then ride back down the mountain at high speed in the complete dark. On September 7th, 1887, Robert Louis Stevenson and his wife Fanny left England for America. When they landed in New York, Robert Louis Stevenson was famous. He was surrounded by reporters, and among the people who came to meet him was Samuel Clemens, or as he's known, Mark Twain. Stevenson hated the attention. Very quickly, he fled to the city to a remote village of Saranac in upper New York State, and there he spent the winter in a virtually unheated house that they shared with the Baker family. Over the winter, RLS and Fanny hatched a plan to rent a sailboat and crew and head into the South Pacific. And on June 28th of 1888, they set sail from San Francisco on the rented yacht Casco. The voyage took them to the Marquesas, Tahiti, eventually Hawaii, where Fanny's daughter and her first husband, Joe Strong, already lived. There are many adventures associated with the South Seas sailings, including nearly signing on murderers as their crew, being windbound and foodless off of Hawaii, being marooned for weeks while the ship was repaired, and being in some danger when a local king lifted the ban of alcohol, opening a whole native population up to a weeks-long binge of drunkenness and violence. RLS met, socialized, and engaged in legendary drinking sessions of his own with the last king of Hawaii, and RLS chose to visit Molokai, the island of lepers, and meet the lepers who were stranded there. Eventually, Stevenson landed in Samoa, where he purchased a piece of land at the foot of a mountain and began the task of renovating it into a self-sustaining plantation. Over the next 4 years, the plantation of Valima was to become home to 4 generations of the Stevenson extended family, including Robert Louis Stevenson, his widowed mother, his wife, her 2 children, her stepdaughter's husband, Joe, and their son, Austin. Today, Robert Louis Stevenson is highly regarded and promoted by Samoans. As Margaret, the museum director at Valima, told me, this was the only house Robert Louis Stevenson built for himself and his family. He chose to live here. He learned our language, and he put Samoa on the map. We read his books, and we sing his songs to his poems. The Samoans gave Stevenson the name Tusitala, or the storyteller. In Samoa, Robert Louis Stevenson continued to write and publish, including major novels like The Master of Ballantrae and Katrina, as well as nonfiction like A Footnote to History, which Samoans regard as a document of the recent past. One book, a short story, The Bottle Nymph, based on a Hawaiian folktale, led the still somewhat superstitious Samoans to believe that anyone who lived in a house as big as Valima must have some kind of actual magic genie hidden in the living room safe. Stevenson even got involved in the Samoan Civil War. And because he supported the Samoan side versus the German-appointed puppet king, he earned further respect from the locals. And here's a picture of the family. There's starting on the left, there's son-in-law Joe Strong in a traditional lava and a parrot on his shoulder, maybe the inspiration for Long John Silver. He was Belle's first philandering husband. Stevenson's mother, looking like Queen Victoria there in her ever-present widow's cap. Stevenson's stepson, Lloyd Osborne, the tall guy in the hat in the middle. Stevenson himself seated there. Fanny Vandegraff Stevenson and their butler, Simi. The next row is Margaret's maid, Mary Carter, who she brought with her from Scotland. The household cook, Aloha. Stevenson's step-grandson, Austin. His mother, Isabel, Austin's mother, Isabel, or Belle Strong. Their cattleman, Lafayla, and the assistant cook, Tomasai. And then in the first row, plantation worker Savea, laundress Elena, and their pantry man Eric. Quite a household staff, quite a group, big family to support off the proceeds of one guy's work as an author. On December 4th, 1894, high above the Stevenson home, a group of Samoan mourners were busy cutting a path through the tropical forest so they could carry the remains of Robert Louis Stevenson to his final resting place. Stevenson's body was draped in a British ensign, and his funeral procession was attended by Catholics, Presbyterians, and village headmen. RLS died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage just 20 days after his 44th birthday, but as noted by Stevenson biographer Ian Bell, the surprise to many was that he had lived so long. Indeed, in Robert Louis Stevenson's own words, "For 14 years, I have not had a day's real health. I have awakened sick and gone to bed weary." Despite that, as I said, Robert Louis Stevenson had written 11 novels, hundreds of short stories and essays, risen to world fame, married, and traveled the world. Stevenson's final resting place on the mountaintop adds one last colorful element to his unique life story. 20 years later, in 1914, when his wife Fanny died, she chose to be buried by his side. Here you can see a historic photo of the gravesite and one taken of me in May of this year, after I made what is still a 45-minute climb up the steep, slippery jungle trail. Today, the site acts as a frequently used recreation and hiking trail for local people, as well as a destination for Robert Louis Stevenson enthusiasts like me. Stevenson is the study of lots of academic studies. Carolyn McCracken Fleischer says that Robert Louis Stevenson is the stealthiest and most subversive of authors. As I've been trying to suggest, the many complex and diverse elements of RLS's life, along with the fact that he wrote in a number of genres, and finally that he sometimes wrote using allegory and allusion rather than explicit descriptions, has opened the opportunity for all sorts of academic studies, including looking at examining specific details of Stevenson's life and his work. For example, in addition to dozens of critical essays that examine the role of all or some specific portions of RLS's writings, McCracken Fleischer's compendium of curriculum topics that can be taught using Stevenson include looking at RLS's role in Scots literature, or in English literature, or in American literature, or in South Seas literature. There continues to be debates whether he's a realist, a modernist, or a romantic. Robert Louis Stevenson can and is studied as a colonialist, as a poet, or as a children's author. There's even curriculum that looks at Robert Louis Stevenson's work as a photographer and his use of light and shadow. Researchers have published papers on Robert Louis Stevenson's knowledge of law. I've come across studies that delve deeply into Stevenson's view on natural history and the intersection of science and nature in his work. There's much discussion on Stevenson in gender and queer studies. In 2016, Stephen Berman wrote an article on how much of Robert Louis Stevenson's work was actually stolen by Arthur Conan Doyle. I've even seen studies published by the Indian School of Psychiatry, of all places, regarding the use of Jekyll and Hyde as a colloquial term to describe dual personalities. One of the RLS's lesser-known books, Travels with a Donkey, is listed by Robert McCrum as number 57 on the list of the 100 greatest books of all time. In my own dissertation, as previously mentioned, I argued the question first proposed by Callum Glennon that Robert Louis Stevenson was the father of modern travel writing, and it's even suggested that he inadvertently invented the sleeping bag. Finally, let's look at how and why Stevenson is commemorated in buildings, museums, statues, etc. This is Robert Louis Stevenson's childhood home at 17 Harriet Row in the Newtown section of Edinburgh. Ownership of this home seems to present a bit of a conundrum for people who live there. As you can see, engraved in the brick is a legend that acknowledges the historic site, which you can't see. Just beside me, that's standing on the front steps, by the doorbell is a sign that says, "This is a private home, not a museum." Apparently they get people ringing their doorbell or standing on their steps getting their picture taken. Robert Louis Stevenson is well represented in Edinburgh. Aside from his home, there's a famous bronze relief of Stevenson that has been in the St. Giles Cathedral since 1904. There's a statue of Stevenson as a boy located near the Water of Leith, and there's a tombstone sort of like memorial in Princess Street Garden. Funny story about the relief in the cathedral is that the original showed Stevenson holding a cigarette, but it had to be changed to be a pen for the installation in the cathedral. And I've seen a replica of the original. They have one in Monterey, California. It's clearly a smoking cigarette, which is more fitting. There's also a Robert Louis Stevenson Club or Society that is based in Edinburgh that was formed in 1920. And it lists its goal as to foster interest in Stevenson's life and work. Edinburgh is also the primary site for Robert Louis Stevenson Day, held on November 13th each year. In 2025, the festivities include some serious literary events, as well as I love this, as a Flash the Stash event, which encourages people to support a cutout of one of the 3 mustache styles supplied on the event's website. Good to have fun. Edinburgh is the home of the Writers' Museum, which conveniently has 3 floors, one of each dedicated to Stevenson, who's in the basement, Burns and Scott. On a recent trip to Edinburgh, I counted 10 different tour guides speaking at least 3 different languages other than English in the square outside of the museum. It's my understanding that the core of the museum's collection, RLS collection, came from the collection of the Stevenson Club, who from 1920 through 1964 maintained another museum at RLS's birthplace, 8 Howard Place, Edinburgh. I visited the Writers' Museum as a tourist, but I've not yet met with anyone from the museum. But it is important to note that the building and this particular site have no real connection to Stevenson outside of being a convenient place for a museum. The Robert Louis Stevenson Cottage in Saranac, New York, was established in 1914 to preserve the home of the Baker family, where RLS resided from October of 1887 through April of 1888. The museum was established by a group of RLS living friends and relatives. This was the first museum, and includes artifacts that remain in the house, as well as many items donated by successive generations of RLS extended family. In the early days, many of Stevenson's relatives and friends visited the museum, gave regular lectures on RLS and his works. Today, the resident caretaker provides tours to casual visitors, as well as RLS scholars who arrive at his doorstep, like me, from around the world. The cottage has changed ownership several times, moving from the Society to the State Park to the town of Saranac, and currently back to the Stevenson Society of America. For 3 generations, the home has been maintained by members of the Delahunt family. Mike Delahunt, who's pictured there in that middle picture with me, grew up and in around the Cottage Museum and has memories of being eye to eye with some of the exhibits that are on tables when he was a small child. Since 1980, Mike, now in his 70s, has actually lived in the back half of the cottage, while the Stevenson memorabilia lived in the front half. Remember, Mike's been there 45 years, and remember, Stevenson only lived there about 6 months. From 2007 through 2017, Mike wrote a weekly newspaper column on the life of Stevenson and the history of the cottage, and by tracing the history of the cottage, Mike has inadvertently retraced the economic state of his own home community of Saranac, as well as the waxing and waning of interest in Robert Louis Stevenson as a cultural icon, and perhaps more importantly, his value in economic development as a tourism draw. And if you were to draw a line from the northeast corner of the United States to the southwest corner of the United States, you'd come very close to moving from Saranac, New York to Monterey, California. Monterey is the site of the Stevenson house, where Robert Louis Stevenson spent the fall of 1879. Stevenson famously traveled to Monterey by steamship and train to pursue, as I've said, a married woman 10 years older than him. What we now know as Stevenson House is one of 13 adobe buildings preserved by the California State Park Service in Monterey. The building was and is perhaps most historically noteworthy for being built as a luxurious home in 1836 for the California Customs Administrator before California became part of the United States. And much of the interest in preserving the building is in preserving this particular example of a 2-story large adobe building. After 1856, the building was used as a general store and eventually as a boarding house called the French Hotel. Stevenson spent much of his time in the boarding house recovering from a near-death incident, but he did write several pieces that include Amateur Immigrant and probably the start of Treasure Island. There's an active Monterey Robert Louis Stevenson Club who hold bi-monthly events and who are currently planning another memorial at a nearby site, the Seminole Plaza, which used to be the restaurant where Stevenson frequented, and it's currently a bus stop. Stevenson wrote a lot about the tinder-dry forests and fires around Monterey, and at one point was amazed when he went to test how dry a tree actually was. And story says that he touched a match to the tree and it burst into flames, and Stevenson had to flee stealthily to avoid detection by local firefighters who were battling other fires in the area. When I visited last fall, Stevenson House was only open by appointment. It does contain numerous RLS artifacts and reproductions, and it is frequented mostly by people with a specific interest in Robert Louis Stevenson. The supposed room that Robert Louis Stevenson used on the second floor is no longer available to visitors because of accessibility regulations. Eventually, as I said, Fanny Osborne was divorced and remarried to Robert Louis Stevenson. To honeymoon, the pair, along with their son Lloyd, headed north from Monterey to a mountainside retreat overlooking what is now famously called the Napa Valley. Traveling by train, the couple landed in the town of Calistoga. Interesting, Robert Louis Stevenson is barely noted in Calistoga, other than a small plaque at the train station, which is a lovely outdoor restaurant and bar. However, there is a fundraising project underway to create and install the statue illustrated above, which depicts Fanny, Louis, and their dog disembarking from the train. Just down the road, and still in the Napa Valley from Calistoga, is another town, St. Helena. St. Helena and the Napa Valley in general are listed among the most affluent areas in the United States. Stevenson had no real connection to St. Helena, but it was the retirement home for Norman H. Strauss when he stepped down as chairman of the board of one of the largest and oldest advertising firms in the world, the J. Walter Thompson Company. Strauss spent a great deal of his personal wealth on amassing what may be the largest and most comprehensive collection of Robert Louis Stevenson artifacts and documents in the world. In 1979, the Strauss collection was housed in a brand new purpose-built museum and archive building built with donor dollars next to the community library. The Strauss collection was donated with the stipulation that admission remain free. The museum operates today by hosting free special events and relying on the donations of its wealthy donors and members. The museum does charge by the hour for use of the archives, which are a rich source of information for academics and biographers. And here you can see a picture of the archives. That's as much money as I spent. Some of the exhibits are there shown, and they're on plinths and in glass cases. And if you look carefully in the exterior shot behind my head there, you can see the museum is surrounded right up to the doors by Napa Valley's famous vineyards. For the past 9 years, the museum has been operated by Executive Director Barrett Dahl. Aside from planning exhibits and special events, conducting tours, and managing the archives, Mrs. Dahl has been extremely active on social media, and she will use any excuse to promote the museum and RLS. For example, on International Dog Day, the museum posted this picture of the dog that belonged to Louis' stepdaughter, along with a poem she wrote about the dog. Ms. Dahl has recently moved on from the museum to another position in California, and that museum is currently looking for a new ED. High above the town of Calistoga is the Robert Louis Stevenson State Park. And although the site does include the site of Louis and Fanny's honeymoon, the park, established in 1993, primarily protects and is promoted as protecting the 5-mile trail to the top of Mount St. Helena, not Mount St. Helens, but Mount St. Helena, which offers a view of most of San Francisco Bay Area. Really has nothing to do with Robert Louis Stevenson. I encountered numerous hikers who were primarily there to cover the entire trail to the summit, and we observed no one stopping at the RLS site. If the park was established in 1993, it has unfortunately seen very little upkeep since then that I could see, and last fall the former parking lot and picnic area were overgrown and the signage was in pretty rough shape, as you can see there, including some bullet holes. However, at mile 1 on the mountain trail, there's a monument to Robert Louis Stevenson. It's very near the site of the mouth of the Silverado mine where Stevenson spent his honeymoon and where his cabin was. And when we arrived, the stone tablet, you can see there, was covered in leaves, dirt, and bird droppings. We had to wash it off. We watched several hikers stride past without a second look on their way to the summit. The mine entrance and the cabin location, and on the right there, that's me in front of the mine, are unmarked and virtually inaccessible up a rock slide. It's quite a scramble. The granite monument was apparently put there in 1911 and it reads as follows. May 1911, the tablet placed by the club women of Napa County marks the site of the cabin occupied 1880 by Robert Louis Stevenson and bride while he wrote the Silverado Squatters. And then there's a poem, doomed to know not winter, only spring, a being, trod the flowery April blithely for a while, took his fill of music, joy of thought and seeing, came and stayed and went, nor ever ceased to smile. I'm not sure why they chose that poem because it was written as a memorial to a friend of Stevenson's, and it was written long after they left, well, a year after they left Silverado, but that's what's on the stone. Time doesn't permit me to talk about all the trails and historic sites around the world that are associated with Robert Louis Stevenson. For example, there are Robert Louis Stevenson schools in Canada, Samoa, New York, California, in Europe. The countries of Belgium, France, Germany, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom have joined in a tourism consortium to promote routes of cultural significance. In Belgium and France, this includes Stevenson's route by canoe and his walking route, both documented in his very early travel books. In Scotland, there's a kidnapped route. I'm glad I'm not on the marketing committee for that. And there's also active Stevenson clubs in places as diverse as Italy, Spain, Russia, and Japan. As an aside, apart from Samoa, Stevenson and his family spent more time in Bournemouth, England than anywhere else. And this is where Stevenson wrote his most famous novels and rose to worldwide acclaim. Somewhat ironically, Robert Louis Stevenson's home, Skerryvore, which you'd think would naturally be a historic site, is apparently the only building in Bournemouth that was destroyed by bombs in the Second World War. This brings us to the independent nation of Samoa and the house that Robert Louis Stevenson built on his plantation, Valima. It's located about 2 miles up the hill from the capital city of Apia. It was through the jungle at the time. It was very safe to say that Robert Louis Stevenson is a cultural icon in Samoa. He's remembered as the man who put Samoa on the map. Robert Louis Stevenson and some of his family members learned Samoan. He wrote some Polynesian folk tales, such as the Bottom Imp, so that they took place in Samoa. He gathered oral histories and wrote a cultural anthropology book detailing the 8 years of Samoan history leading up to the Civil War. Stevenson also defended Samoa during a time of colonial domination. Samoans study Robert Louis Stevenson throughout their school years. They sing songs set to verses of Stevenson's poetry, and they promote him, seemingly above their own culture, as a tourism attraction. Valima was a magnificent structure for Samoa, with exotic imported woods and the only fireplace in the entire country. In the 1890s, the furnishings included Robert Louis Stevenson's mother's piano, which she brought from Edinburgh, which was carried 2 miles through the jungle by the Samoans, a statue that Robert Louis Stevenson was gifted by Rodin, and a tablecloth gifted to him by Queen Victoria. Today, at the end of every tour, the local guides sing a song based on the poem inscribed on Robert Louis Stevenson's tomb. The museum manager, Margaret Silva Felice, told me that she got into administration because after several years as a tour guide, she was tired of crying every day. Margaret also told me how proud Samoans are that Robert Louis Stevenson chose to live and be buried in Samoa. She said, "We know that other places have more artifacts and have a better climate for preserving things, but he chose to be buried here. We have his bones." After Robert Louis Stevenson's death, the building became the home of the German governor of Samoa and then the Samoan head of state. Twice in the 1990s, the building was damaged by cyclones, but it was purchased by two former Latter-day Saint missionaries and restored with foreign money. The museum opened in 1994 to mark the centennial of RLS's death. Funding continues to come from a society based in the United States. However, both of the original owners, I learned, have passed away, and the museum is going to revert to the Samoan government in approximately 2 or 3 years. Margaret is quite concerned about this because the Samoan system of government is complex and somewhat disorganized, and Margaret is concerned that future governments may not dedicate the resources necessary to maintain the museum. For me, Samoa has been a wonderful surprise. By far the most interesting part of my journey of discovery was found in Samoa. I had no concept of the depth of emotion and the importance that Samoan people felt for Robert Louis Stevenson. And I want to thank the museum manager, Margaret Silva Felice, for taking the time from her busy and important work to have a very open and meaningful conversation with me before she sent me off to climb a mountain. In summary, why are we fascinated by Robert Louis Stevenson 175 years after he was born? Well, the simple answer is because he is fascinating. His life and his works are complex, controversial, and diverse. In the words of Stevenson biographer Ian Bell, Stevenson is like a portrait attempted too often. Stevenson has acquired many faces. None are fixed. We impose Stevenson on him, and we take what we need. He is an odd sort of mirror. As I stated at the outset, I contend that Stevenson is a palimpsest. We can use that canvas of his life and his work to create museums and parks, to sell biographies that tell sordid tales of sex, drugs, and tropical adventures, and to explore topics from human psychology through to South Seas anthropology. And last but not least, I want to thank my amazing faculty advisors, Professor Donald Heddle at University of the Highlands and Islands, who's here in the room with me, and Professor Jeannie Thomas, who's watching from Utah State University. And together they manage once a month to arrange a meeting that covers 7 time zones to meet with me virtually. Thanks to my lovely wife, who's watching also, for all of her help. And thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to this seminar.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thoroughly enjoyed that. I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. What I'll do just now is I will open up the people's microphones and cameras so you can put your questions directly to Jim. Or if you would prefer, you can pop your questions in the chat and I can read them out for you. Just bear with me for 2 seconds. Then you should be able to access your cameras and microphones now. So I'll let people grab their breath, and if they've got questions, feel free to pop your hand up. I can maybe get the... Oh no, Alison, sorry, you were straight in.
Hi, Jim. I really
Can't hear you.
Sorry, Alison, 2 seconds. One thing I didn't check was the volume. Shoot, there you go.
No, it's not my fault.
Just out of interest, said that family was Alpha, and that's a name associated with Canadian.
Sorry, Alison, we can't hear you, so I'm just going to try and fix this. Alison, would you mind maybe just popping that in the chat just now while I try and fix the volume?
It's great. I bring in noted PhDs to do my technical work.
Let's just recap. We can add the non-sequitur that you were talking about, the actor who portrayed Long John Silver.
Yes.
Tomorrow is International Talk Like a Pirate Day.
Yes. That's right. Exactly. Yeah. Talking Like a Pirate is actually not attributed to Wallace Beery, but to the 1950 film by Disney, which is really the Robert. Yes, exactly. He's everywhere. Stevenson is everywhere, even though we don't know it.
Alison, could I ask a favour? Could you just say something, see if I fixed the volume or if I failed miserably?
There's Jim. Can you hear me?
Still a bit faint.
Still very faint. I'm wondering if it's maybe...
Can you hear me?
Yes, very faintly, Alison.
Faintly.
Yeah. You want to ask the question again?
Okay. So you mentioned that his family name was Balfour. Is that right?
Yes, family name, which you mentioned, the family name was Balfour, is that?
Balfour, yes, his mother's name was, his mother was a Balfour.
So Balfour, the surname is connected with have an Orcadian background.
Yeah, the Balfour surname is connected with Orkney. Is there any connection, any background there at all?
I don't know, actually, that's a good question. Something I haven't come across.
It's interesting you raised it to Alison, because actually we've been in touch with the Orkney Archive, and they've got some papers and things
Yeah.
to look at, and I think the name Balfour is in there.
It could be. Certainly the Stevenson family built lighthouses here and were here, but Robert Louis Stevenson himself was here, but I don't know about his mother's family.
Well, Balfour is actually a name from Fife. So it's possible there is a connection
Possible.
to that. Yeah.
Another PhD, Carol Brooks, doing the lighthouse, Vestry.
We only got parts of that, Alison, sorry. It's coming through very faintly, your audio.
Okay. The lighthouse in Vestry was associated with the Stevenson family. I know Carol Brooks, another PhD student, is doing a PhD on family in Vestry.
Yes.
That connection.
That's certainly something to investigate.
Yeah, there's certainly between Stevenson's father, his uncles, his cousins, his grandfather. I mean, yeah, there are actually lists I know of which relative built which is associated with which lighthouse.
That's Carol just popped in the chat there, Alison. She said, not so much a question as an observation. I'm looking into the life of and work of RSL's cousin's daughter, D.E. Stevenson. There are many parallels in how her work has been received to early reception of RLS. I'd value a chance to at some point have a chat, Jim.
Sure.
And also P.S. Stevenson's dad is D.E. Stevenson. Dad is responsible for Newphead Lighthouse.
Yes. Thank you.
Any other questions, folks? Thank you, Alison. Jan's got a question in the chat. That was very interesting, especially how RLS is celebrated around the world. I studied RLS with Donna many years ago, back when you couldn't do an honours degree. It was a real eye-opener for me, especially all the sexual references in Jekyll and Hyde.
Yeah, well, it's certainly, there's a lot of implied sexual references in Jekyll and Hyde, and people have made the most of it. It gets over-sexualized, I think. Over-sexualized. It certainly gets more explicit in the movies than it does in the novel itself. I think that's one of the interesting things about Stevenson, is that he implied things and Victorians laid their own thoughts on it, and that continues to this day. I think people read Stevenson and as I mentioned, see it as a mirror and take back from it what they want to put into it.
Just to say that to the thing about the Victorian culture, everybody knew these things were going on, the kind of sex with underage girls and things like that, but the crime that could not speak its name was homosexuality. It was a different level of that was the unforgivable, unforgivable crime. And I suppose that's one of the problem we have with Jekyll and Hyde is, of course, you can only read it once without knowing what's happening. Remember, we all know what the plot twist is, but when you read the book, it's, as you said, it's like a detective mystery story. You don't know, but we all know, and we all know because we've seen it on the telly. So we're filtering it in that way, which is quite interesting, because you were talking to about Robert Louis Stevenson, his face, the persona changing, well, the persona of his books changes as well because of the way that we access them.
Even the title itself, the actual title of the book is "Strange Case of Jekyll and Hyde," of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. not the strange case, just strange case, which puts a lot of emphasis on the fact that it is, and it's narrated by a lawyer. Yeah, did Stevenson write it as a detective novel as much as a horror story? I think probably.
Yeah. Of course, we never find out what the thing in the potion is
Right.
that makes it work.
Right.
It's like H.G. Wells, we don't know how the time machine works.
Never actually
Never
saw.
explained.
Yeah.
We've got another question from Molly, and before I bring you in, Molly, Lynn's just popped in the chat there, so she's obviously gone and checked Hostick. She says that there's no connection with Stevenson, and Hostick only refers to his name once in his history and only in connection to the history that's surrounding the former Gospel Hall in Victoria Street. Molly, come on in.
Hello. It was a great lecture. Thank you so much. Just to clarify, I think David Balfour, who had Shepherdsade Castle built, was a close personal friend of RLS. So, and that's where he gets the name from. So, in Kidnapped. But my question is, I was wondering, have you walked the Travels with My Donkey way? Because I'm lucky enough to be going to Florac for 3 months over winter, and I was wondering if you'd walked the path and
I have
if there's any
not.
tips you could. Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, no, I have not. That's maybe my next adventure in pursuit of Robert Louis Stevenson. I have looked. There's quite an active website. Suddenly, I'm a tourism promoter. There's quite an active website that mostly seems to talk about like bed and breakfasts along the way. So I think it's quite a well promoted and active tourism trail.
Well, I didn't know about the book, so it was really handy to see the book in the PowerPoint, and I've just ordered that. And I'm staying with a lady who is part of the History Society of Florac, Cecile, and she's got lots of archive documents, facsimiles of documents when they set up the trail, when they reset it up, if you like. So she might be a good contact if you ever want to be down in that neck of the woods and do the trail.
Interesting. Yeah. So Stevenson, he walked that trail sort of in the period in 1879 when Fanny got her telegram from her husband and headed back to California. And before he headed off to California is when he took off with a donkey and despite his health, like spent his time sleeping on the ground and traveling.
And invented
with the donkey
sleeping bags.
and invented the sleeping bag, apparently.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it's quite an interesting, it's an interesting book, mostly a relationship between him and the donkey. That's what it is about.
So lovely, but I'm looking forward to it. Thank you. It was really interesting. Very
Look
much
forward to
enjoyed
hearing about your travels.
it. Thank you.
Super, thank you, Molly. Any other questions?
So yeah, I have a
Go on,
question.
of course.
I have a question.
Oh, no.
Yeah, no, it's like you said right at the beginning that how Robert Louis Stevenson was dismissed
Yes.
as from an academic point of view because of the range of things that he did. In fact, the different kinds of the different genres. Is it possible that is actually his great strength? That's what's made him survive, because there are all these different ways to access Robert Louis Stevenson.
Oh, I believe so. I believe that's certainly kept him in the public eye because people that read poetry can read his poetry, and people that read Gothic horror can read his Gothic horror, and people that read boys' adventures, and all those things can be made into movies. So yeah, I think that's what has kept him alive and in the public eye, and what has contributed to his revitalization, because if something has stayed in the public eye for 100